What happens when an official report meets public footage? When seconds of confrontation turn into weeks of national debate? In today's America, events don't just unfold. They are recorded, replayed, and re-examined in real time. This is not about speculation. This is not about taking sides. This is about facts, process, and the space between authority and accountability. Welcome to a deeper analysis of the Minneapolis federal officer shooting controversy, where we break down what was said, what was sane, and why it matters. Stay with me, because the details change everything. 1 confrontation. 2 narratives. Millions watching. In an era where every moment is documented, truth is no longer just reported, it's analyzed. Let's examine what really unfolded. Step by step. The incident that shook a city. What happens when the truth and the official story don't match? Not by a little, but fundamentally. In Minneapolis this January, a federal law enforcement operation quickly spiraled into one of the most controversial UZV force episodes in recent American history, and the first layer of that story is only the beginning. On January 14, 2026, an immigration enforcement operation in North Minneapolis escalated into chaos. Federal immigration officers engaged Julio Cesar, a Venezuelan man, in a confrontation that ended with him being shot in the leg. In their first public statement, federal officials said the encounter followed a vehicle stop and escalated into a struggle. Authorities described the situation as involving an object during the confrontation, which they cited as a factor in the use of force. But here's where the real mystery begins, when the official narrative seemed to diverge sharply from lurking video, evidence, and local reaction. This wasn't just another press release. It was a story with fissures beneath the surface. On that winter morning, federal agents were conducting managed deportation enforcement as part of a broader, highly publicized surge in Minneapolis, a city already shaken by protests over previous officer-involved shootings. Tens of millions of viewers across social platforms saw clips of bystanders capturing the operation, only for these visuals to sometimes contradict the initial descriptions given by DHS. Critically, the authorities said defensive force was justified because the man resisted and posed a threat, but early videos shared online painted a different picture, one of confusion, escalation, and unanswered questions. Several witnesses described the scene as unnervingly rapid. Officers tackling individuals, pepper spraying onlookers, and chaos erupting on the street. This new layer didn't match standard procedure. It hinted at something deeper, a break in narrative control that would ignite national debate. It was at once a legal case and a psychological shockwave, raising a fundamental question. Can we trust the official version of events? And just as this narrative began to spread across news feeds and time, new evidence was already surfacing, ready to challenge everything authorities had initially said. Now we examine how video evidence and eyewitness accounts directly contradicted the official story, shaking public faith and sparking widespread outrage, and why this matters more than the surface headline. Video evidence versus official statements. When cameras everywhere document everything, truth becomes harder to control and impossible to ignore. In the hours after the Minneapolis shooting, federal authorities delivered a clear narrative. A Venezuelan man was allegedly assaulting officers, resisting arrest, and that deadly force was a last resort. DHS spokespeople described an armed confrontation where officers were forced to defend themselves, but then multiple videos, some captured by bystanders, others circulating widely on social media, began to tell a story that didn't align with those claims. People saw something far more disturbing: moments of struggle, confusion, and actions that did not resemble a violent attack, but instead resembled chaotic restraint and escalating force. One widely shared clip showed the individual, Julio Cesar, in a position that seemed defensive or hesitant rather than aggressively confronting officers. Another angle suggested that his legally carried firearm had been removed prior to the shooting. The visual disparity was stark. Where the official narrative spoke of imminent danger, video imagery presented a man who may not have posed a lethal threat at the moment of injury. This contradiction struck at the core of public trust. Americans began asking not just what happened, but was the story tailored before the facts emerged? When narrative meets video evidence, the consequence isn't just confusion, it's distrust. For communities already uneasy about federal law enforcement, seeing video footage that challenges official accounts ignited questions that legal documents could no longer simply gloss over. But the contradictions didn't stop with this one incident. Similar cases in Minneapolis, including the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty in late January, added to a pattern where initial official descriptions appeared inconsistent with later visuals, intensifying scrutiny of enforcement tactics. Public trust is fragile when official accounts and recorded reality diverge. This tension drove growing outrage and pushed many community leaders to demand deeper transparency. At this time, we shift focus to how public, political, and legal reactions erupted, turning this from a local incident into a national controversy with protests, leadership positions, and calls for accountability. Public reaction, political pressure, and a city on edge when trust fractures. The reaction is never quiet. It spreads. It intensifies. It demands answers. What began as a single enforcement operation in Minneapolis was no longer just about one confrontation. It had become a flashpoint, a test of credibility, leadership, and accountability in real time. Within hours of the shooting, social media amplified the footage. Community organizers mobilized. Local leaders were pressed for statements. The speed of public reaction wasn't accidental. Minneapolis carries historical memory. The city has experienced high-profile law enforcement controversies before. That history changes how new incidents are perceived, and perception shapes momentum. Crowds gathered near the location of the incident. Protesters called for transparency, bought camera releases, an independent review. Advocacy groups questioned the escalation of force. Federal officials urged patience and emphasized internal review procedures. Two narratives formed almost immediately. One focused on officer safety and operational complexity. The other focused on transparency and proportionality. In polarized environments, truth is often filtered through belief, and belief spreads faster than investigation. But here is where the tension deepened. Political figures, local, state, and national, began weighing in. Some defended the officers, citing the risks law enforcement faces daily. Others demanded an independent federal probe, arguing that internal review alone would not restore public confidence. Press conferences became strategic. Words were measured. Statements were cautious, because every sentence now mattered. When a case crosses from local enforcement into national debate, the pressure changes. It becomes about precedent, about institutional trust, about whether transparency is immediate or delayed. Legal analysts began dissecting use of force standards. Civil rights attorneys raised concerns about procedure. Federal representatives stated that all actions were consistent with training and policy. Yet one central question remained unanswered in the public mind. If the initial description of events does not align with visual evidence, what else might be incomplete? That question lingered, not just in Minneapolis, but across the country. Controversial cases do more than divide opinion. They create uncertainty. Uncertainty triggers emotion. Emotion fuels narrative, and narrative drives national attention. In the days following the shooting, the debate shifted from what happened to who controls the story. Community leaders called for independent oversight. Federal agencies emphasized procedural review. Meanwhile, journalists continued analyzing footage frame by frame. Trust does not collapse instantly. It erodes gradually, especially when transparency feels delayed. And that perception alone can intensify a public response. But public pressure is only one side of this story. Behind the headlines, investigations move quietly. Internal reviews, statements, under oath, documentation analysis, and sometimes, what surfaces during those investigations changes everything. Because when official statements are later examined under scrutiny, small inconsistencies can become major consequences. In this part of documentary, we enter the most critical phase of this controversy: the investigations, the legal exposure, and the questions surrounding accuracy in official reporting. And this is where the stakes shift from public debate to accountability. Investigations, inconsistencies, and the question of accountability. Public reaction creates noise, but investigations create consequences. As protests continued and national attention intensified, the focus quietly shifted behind closed doors from public debate to internal review. Because once statements are released, They don't just shape perception. They become evidence. Federal authorities confirmed that the shooting would undergo formal review. Standard procedure includes internal assessment, potential Department of Justice oversight, and examination of use of force compliance. On paper, this is routine, but this case was no longer routine. Because now there was video. There were witnesses. There were timelines being compared. Minute by minute. And when investigators begin aligning official statements with recorded footage, small discrepancies matter. Here is where the story becomes more complex. Reports emerged that certain details in the initial federal briefing were under scrutiny. Legal experts began discussing whether early descriptions of the encounter fully matched the visual evidence that had surfaced publicly. In high-profile cases, accuracy in first statements is critical, not only for legal reasons, but for credibility. If early accounts require clarification later, it opens a larger question. Was the information incomplete or prematurely framed? That distinction matters. Because if facts evolve naturally during investigation, that is procedural. But if information appears inconsistent with recorded evidence, that becomes something else entirely. Accountability in federal operations follows a layered process. Internal review, independent oversight, if warranted. Prosecutorial analysis, administrative discipline, each layer carries weight. Each layer affects public trust. Meanwhile, civil rights advocates pushed for transparency beyond internal channels. They called for body camera release, full timeline disclosure, and independent examination of officer conduct. Federal representatives responded cautiously, reiterating that investigations must follow protocol and that premature conclusions would undermine due process. Two forces were now moving at the same time: public urgency, institutional procedure, and those forces rarely move at the same speed. There is something powerful about contested narratives. When official authority and public evidence appear misaligned, people begin searching for patterns. They analyze language. They dissect press statements. They question timing. Trust is not only about outcome, it is about process. And process transparency determines whether a case resolves quietly or continues escalating. As scrutiny intensified, discussions expanded beyond this single event. Commentators began examining broader enforcement strategy in Minneapolis. Was this an isolated miscalculation, or part of a larger operational tension? In moments like this, institutions are tested not by perfection, but by response. How they clarify, how they correct, how they disclose, and whether they do so proactively or only after pressure mounts. But investigations do not only determine responsibility, they shape precedent. Because what happens next will not just affect one city or one department. It will influence how federal operations are viewed nationwide. Will this case close quietly after review? Or will it redefine expectations for transparency in federal enforcement? We step back from the immediate controversy and examine the broader implications for public trust, federal accountability, and the future of high-risk operations in politically sensitive cities. Because sometimes, the most important question isn't what happened, it's what changes because it happened. What changes after the headlines fade, when the cameras leave, when the protests slow, when the statements stop trending. That's when the real impact begins. Because controversial incidents do not end when investigations conclude. They echo through policy, through perception, and through public trust. The Minneapolis federal shooting controversy is no longer just about one confrontation on one street. It has become part of a larger national conversation. How power is exercised, how force is justified, and how transparency is delivered. And that conversation is far from over. The broader question: high-risk federal operations have always carried tension. They require rapid decisions under pressure. Officers are trained to assess threats in seconds, but the public judges those decisions for years. That imbalance creates friction. This case introduced three powerful forces into one moment: operational authority, public recording, instant national scrutiny. In today's environment, law enforcement actions are no longer interpreted only through official reports. They are examined frame by millions of viewers. That changes everything. When institutions know their actions will be publicly dissected in real time, transparency is no longer optional. It becomes strategic. The Minneapolis controversy may ultimately lead to procedural adjustments, clearer communication protocols, or independent oversight reforms, whether formally announced or quietly implemented. High-profile cases often influence internal training long after headlines disappear. But here is the deeper psychological layer. Trust is not built by perfection. It is built by response. If investigations conclude clearly, transparently, and consistently with evidence, public confidence can recover. If questions linger, if clarity feels delayed, skepticism hardens. This is why the outcome of this case matters beyond legal conclusions. Because institutions do not operate in isolation, they operate in perception. And perception shapes cooperation. Cooperation shapes safety. The most powerful consequence of controversial incidents is not always legal. It is cultural. How communities respond next time. How officers approach next time. How quickly narratives are believed or doubted. A national reflection. Minneapolis has, in recent years, become symbolic in national conversations about policing and accountability. That context amplified this event. Every new incident now carries historical weight, which means this case was never just about one enforcement action. It became a referendum on process, on communication, on whether official statements align seamlessly with observable reality. In an era where every phone has a camera, every statement competes with footage, and footage rarely stays hidden. The question now is not only what happened on that day, it is what lessons remain. Will federal agencies adapt communication strategies? Will oversight mechanisms evolve? Will public trust strengthen or weaken? Controversy fades, but institutional memory does not. Because in modern America, the truth is not just written in reports. It is recorded, replayed, re-examined. And when narratives collide with evidence, history tends to remember which one held stronger. This case may close officially, but the conversation it sparked is just beginning, and in the space between authority and accountability, the next chapter is always waiting. In cases like this, conclusions may be written in reports, but public understanding is shaped by transparency. If you value analysis over noise, context over chaos, and facts over reaction, this channel is built for you. Subscribe for structured breakdowns of high-impact cases shaping national conversations. Because in modern America, the story doesn't end when the headlines fade. It evolves, and we'll be here to examine what comes next. The story isn't finished. The implications are just beginning. In the next part, we break down the element most people overlooked. Make sure you're subscribed because the next detail changes the perspective entirely.